Okay, I want to continue to examine the element nodes of what we can go ahead and put into our scene graph. We've previously seen how we could go ahead and put an image view into our scene graph. Let's look at the other very critical type of data that we'd want to display in a graphic user interface, and that's going to be text. So a quick introduction to this. We'll introduce what the concept of our text element node is. We'll take a look at some text examples. We're going to look at all the different things we can set in text. So we can set the text itself. We can set the font of the text. We can set the fill color of the text. We could set the stroke color of the text. We can set the X and Y position of the text, the origin point of the text, how to essentially define multi-line text. We could do strike through on our text. We can do underlining on our text. And then we can even do like smoothing techniques on our text. So a quick intro here is that the JavaFX text element can display a text inside of one of the JavaFX GUI components. So the JavaFX text element is represented by the JavaFX class, JavaFX. Inside of the JavaFX is the scene package. Inside the scene package is a text package. Then we have the concrete class text that allows us to actually build a text instance. You can set the font to be used by the text element, or the text size, or font decorations, and many other things. Since the JavaFX text is a subclass of the JavaFX shape class, the text class has all the same methods available that other JavaFX shape objects do. So that's what gives us the fill and stroke color and the style. And the JavaFX text is also a subclass of the JavaFX node class. So the text class also has the same methods available that any of the JavaFX nodes might have, such as set effect or what have you. So a quick demo of or example of how our JavaFX text example might look like. We have our JavaFX application. We would import our scene. We'd import our stage. Let me do this in this order, the way that, so we would import our stage. We'd import our layout like a vertical box, and then finally we'd import our text. So here I'm going to create a class that extends application. I'm going to create a main method that calls the launch function inside of JavaFX. I got to create a start method since I extend application that takes in a stage. Here I can just invoke the constructor of text, pass it a string, which is the text I want to display in there. Then I could save a reference to it as a text data type. Then when I go to set text, text itself isn't a layout component, so it has to be put into a layout component if I want to add it to the scene, because it's got to be inserted to the scene graph if I want it to display, if I want it to be visible. So I'm going to create a new vertical box, a new V box. I'm going to pass my text element into that. And then that's going to be added to my scene. I'm also going to give my scene, let's say, a width and a height. And so I'll save my scene instance so that I can then tell my stage to set the scene with that content, with that layout element and that text. And finally, I'll make that stage show. I'll go ahead and display the contents. So that's just a quick example of how we might use text. So let's see here what examples we have inside of our sample code here. So here, let's go to text. Yeah, so let's just have this one example. I'll wait to use this example at the very end after we cover all the concepts. So if I want to set text, you can set the text of a JavaFX text object via its set text method. So here's just a quick example of how we can set the text of a JavaFX text element. So suppose I had this element, an empty element, where I just call the default constructor, but don't set any text. Then later on, if I want to set the text, or if I want to change the text that's in a pre-existing text element, I can just call this set text method and pass in a string. Suppose I want to go ahead and set the font inside of my text. So if I set the font, I can set the font family. Here they have the set font method that allows me to do that. And here's some example code right here of setting fonts for a JavaFX text object. So suppose that I have a text element here that just has some text. Then I can say, okay, text set font. And if we're going to set the font, we actually have to pass it a font data type. So we can use the font class to go ahead and get back a font object, a font instance using the font method, and then passing in as a string the type of font we want to get back. And it's going to, and we would import that font class here from JavaFX.scene.text.font. We can also go ahead and set the font weight and the font size. So the font class actually also lets you specify the weight and size of the font. And so if we want to do that, when we go and have a text element, and when we go to set our font, again, we have to set the font using a font instance. Well, we can get our font instances from the font class. So here from the font class, we'll call the static method font, where we can pass in not only the font name that we want, but as a second parameter, we can go ahead and get font weight and do like bold, or the default is normal. You could do also italics. And we can access the font weight from the font of the JavaFX scene text, and then inside of the text package is a font weight class that has these values that these constants that we can go ahead and access for our parameters. And then the third parameter is going to be the font size. Suppose we want to fill the color of our text. Well, being a shape or being a subclass to the shape class, you can set the fill color of a JavaFX text control. The fill color is inside the color used to draw the text. And so you set the fill color of a text element using the setFill method. So just a quick example of what that looks like. We might have our text element here that has some text. Then on that text element, that text instance we have, we can call the setFill, and then we pass in a color. And in this instance, we would do color.yellow. And again, the color class has a collection of constant values that represent colors like yellow or purple or red or blue or green. Suppose we wanted to do the stroke color. So being, again, a shape, you can also set the stroke color of the JavaFX text element, where the stroke color is the outline or the boundary color used to draw the text. By default, text is rendered only using the fill color, but by setting a stroke color, it can add a nice effect. So you set the stroke color of a text element via its setStroke method, which takes a JavaFX color object as a parameter. So here's an example of setting a stroke color of a JavaFX text element. So suppose here we have some text element with some text there. We can call setStroke and then just pass in a value that is a color. And again, we can access those from the color class. It has a bunch of constants defined in there. If we wanted to go ahead and set the X and Y position of our text, well, X and Y position elements are determined where inside its parent container element, remember, it has to be a member of something that's a parent, that's essentially usually a layout container or a layout element. So our XY will tell us where we are relative into our parent container where we want our text to be displayed. So provided the parent container respects the position, so for instance, pane does, but VBox does not, you can set the X and Y position of a text element by its methods setX and setY. So this would be an example of that, where we will create some text and then we can call setX and pass it in a value, setY, pass it a numerical value, and that'll be the XY coordinate space inside of our parent container that we would set that text. We can also set the origin. So the JavaFX text element has an origin, which controls how the text is displayed relative to the Y position of the text element. You set the origin using the text setText origin method. So again, if we want to take a quick example of this, suppose I have some text element I created with some text in there, then I can say, hey, text, set your text origin. And so here they have v position, or VPOS. And so there's a number of different constant values inside of the class VPOS that we can choose between to be able to set what the origin point will be. And so VPOS baseline is going to be, and again, V stands for vertical. So this is essentially the vertical position of where our task origin point starts. So so for VPOS baseline, the Y position of the text is interpreted to mean that the Y baseline of the displayed text will be just above. So the text is displayed just above the baseline with some characters extending below the baseline. We can do the vertical position for bottom, center, and top. And this is going to affect how, like, where the text is rendered from when it goes to render. So the Y position of the text is interpreted to mean the bottom of the displayed text, lower than the baseline, where center would be centered or to the text vertically, and then top would be rendered above the baseline to the top of the text vertically. So it just gives you a lot of control on where you're going to set the origin point for rendering the text from. Let's talk a little bit about the multi-line text, or doing line breaks, using line breaks for multi-line text. So the JavaFX text element will break the text it displays to multiple lines based on a couple of rules. There's two rules that we can define. The first is we can add in line breaks like we normally do. So here's a first example showing a text that contains a line break, where if I create a text and pass in my string, and if I put a new line character, right, in an escape sequence that has this new line, then the text element will automatically break where that new line's inserted at. So we can do what we normally would expect the behavior would be in a Java string. Alternate way is we can, if the text width exceeds the wrapping width set on our text element, then it'll decide where to break the text. So for instance, here's an example where we can set a wrapping width on our JavaFX text element. So suppose I have this text element that has this really long JavaFX text. And then let's say that I set the wrapping width to 80. So the JavaFX text element will attempt to break the text between words. So if after a specific word, the text width is wider than the wrapping width, the text element will wrap the text before the word, and it makes the text wider than the wrapping width. So those are the two ways that we can effectively ensure we can print multiple lines. We can either set the wrapping width or just encode new line characters in. One's like more organic than the other. I think one's more flexible than the other, though. Text strike-through. So the JavaFX text element enables you to apply a strike-through decoration to the text it displays. You enable the strike-through decoration via the text set strike-through method, passing a value of true as a parameter and a parameter value of false to disable the strike-through. So here's an example of enabling the JavaFX strike-through decoration. So if we had some text element, we do set strike-through to true, and then we'll just strike through that text. We can also underline elements using an underline method. So set underline, and again, it either takes a true or a false. If we set to true, it'll underline that piece of text, and if we set to false, it'll disable underline. And it's nice because as your application executes, you can toggle these on and off strike throughs, or turn that back off, set underline, and turn that back off. And the last thing I kind of want to just mention with text is the font smoothing technique. So the JavaFX text element contains two different font smoothing techniques that you can choose between. The first is called LCD. The second is called gray. You can choose which font smoothing technique the text element should use using the set font smoothing type method. And so just a quick example of what that would look like would be here. Suppose we have this text element. Well, I can put set font smoothing type to, and again, inside of the class font smoothing type, it has as constants the option to either pass gray or LCD. And so the nice thing about this is if you want fonts that have a smoother, a non-pixelated appearance, you do have that option while you're testing out. If you notice that you have that issue, you can resolve it with these calls. And that's it. That's just a quick crash course through the text element that's available to us in JavaFX. And so what I would like to do, though, is show a quick demo. So let's go here to text. Let's open this up. And so here, just a quick walkthrough. I'm going to create this. Let's see what our imports are. So I'm going to go ahead and import application. I'm going to import the stage. All right, I'm going to import the scene. I'm going to import a vertical position so we can go ahead and use that. I'm going to put that down here though. Okay, let's take our text. Let's move that up here. Perfect. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to import my scene. I'm going to import my pane, which is my layout. It's going to be my layout component. And remember, pane respects position. So we could do things like set X and set Y, and we'll respect that. Going to import the text element because that's what we're actually wanting to play around with. And then other things that we might want to play around with is going to be the color of the text, the font, that font smoothing type, the font weight, and again, that V position on where it's going to go ahead and start rendering at. So let me go here. Let me grab this text example here. Let's jump over to my example runner. And so right inside of here, I'm going to go text example .main. I'm going to pass in my args that, and here, let's go ahead and run that. Give it just a moment. It's going to compile. It's building out our project, and then it will launch JavaFX to deploy my windowed application. And there it is. This is a JavaFX text. Okay, let's see what's actually happening here. So let's jump over here. Oops. Stop that. And let's run that again from here. Oh, that's all right. So what was happening there? We saw the application. So we saw the text that we just created. This is JavaFX test, and then line 2. So we create a new text element, and then I use the set font smoothing. We could do all these other things. Let's go ahead and implement set Strikethrough and set underline to true. Let's set the wrapping width. Okay, let's go ahead and save all that, and let's jump back over here to our example runner and see what some of those properties look like. And again, I'll go ahead and provide these all these demos that's you, so you have all this code you can play around with and see. Up, and you can see here's all the things where I have underlines on it, and I have my color that I've applied to it, and I have my strike throughs. Excellent. And let me go back to our slides. It takes my system just a moment to be able to switch between desktops. Excellent. And so really, yeah, we've seen a quick demo, and I'll make that code available to everyone so that you can play around with it and fiddle around with the various properties.